Hello, welcome to Contemplations of the Lotus Eaters, where we take a topic that isn't necessarily contemporary news and we pick out things that are what we deem valuable and we talk about them in great detail. And today I'm joined by Hugo and I'm
Hello.
Josh, and we're going to talk about why some countries are poor.
Yeah. So, in general, this topic is it's called development economics or economics of development, and it's focusing on which countries are poor, which ones are rich, and what causes that, right? And so that's it's kind of $1 million question for economists and for political scientists as well, and it's something that it's kind of the biggest question in the field. Let's say I don't want to like steal their position from some other important question, but this is something that a lot of people are focused on, and a good answer to that is something that can have immense
It
consequences.
certainly seems like almost the point of economics existing in the first place. You want to understand the economy to maximise an economy's wealth.
Yeah.
That seems pretty intuitive to me.
Yeah, and like the guy who's usually dubbed as being the father of economics, Adam Smith, his magnum opus was Wealth of Nations,
Of
and
course.
that's this, right? So why are some nations rich, and what actually is the Wealth of Nations, and how does it come about? So that's the whole point. That's the starting point of economics originally. It doesn't like not necessarily the most kind of interesting for some people or important in some respects, but this is kind of the central question to it all. So that's kind of development theories. Development theories are kind of trying to answer this question, and often trying to answer it from an empirical perspective. So looking at existing countries and saying, okay, so this country has these types of circumstances, and it's is poorer or richer, and so what can we deduce from it? Or we can look at a whole array of countries and say these have these things in common, and so therefore these things cause wealth, and these things
So
cause
it's trying to
poverty.
isolate the factors which promote wealth and the factors which don't encourage wealth. I guess that's a really bad way of putting it, but
Yeah. No, something like that, definitely. And so, specifically, I want to talk about one theory, and not all of them, because you can't talk about all of them adequately in
of course.
in one episode. So that's not happening. But I want to focus on one specifically, and that's the theory of Acemoglu and Robinson, which is sometimes called the theory of institutions. But they wrote a book that's become a bestseller. It's become famous, and everyone knows it. It's called Why Nations Fail. And so, and
I
so
haven't heard of it. Just just throwing that out there.
no, like I don't mean everyone. I mean like everyone who is kind of orbiting
Okay.
these fields, right? So it's written in a very popular language. It's
Hmm.
not technical, and so it has a wide audience. Right, and so before we get into that specific theory, it's worth kind of considering a bit of framing. We talked about framing in one of the earlier
I
episodes.
did indeed.
So
Also have a very good article about it on
true,
lotuseaters.com.
true, and so and so that discussion point about framing is you can ask the same question in different ways. Why are some countries rich, or why are some countries poor? And that's kind of interesting and important, because with each you presume a different thing, a different underlying reality. Because with each you take a different state as the default state. So if you ask why are countries rich, you take poverty as the default state and saying, okay, some of them are rich, so how did they get there? But if you ask why some countries are poor, then you presume that wealth, or at least some kind of prosperity, is the norm, is the default, and then some countries do something bad, and therefore they get poor, right?
So your frame of reference shifts between each question. So
Mm-hmm.
although they are discussing the same essential characteristics,
Yes.
that the way in which you frame the question changes what factors you consider.
Yeah, and it's why it's important is because if you actually frame it as why are countries poor, which is what I've done, but I didn't mean to in this context, is that you say wealth is the norm and poverty is the exception. Poverty is something that you cause by doing something wrong, and that can lead you to some very murky conclusions economically, right? Because then you and you can get into bad politics through bad economics in the same way, right?
Sure.
And so you can get into the mindset of, okay, there is a lot of wealth in the world, and so what you just need to do is to redistribute it, and everything's going to be fine, and everyone's going to be living a good life, and you can just, if you do something like that, you overlook the importance of production, because we all consume things, so you need a way to produce things, and so wealth is not what you have now, because if that's what you have now, well, in a little bit you're not going to have it anymore. So the important thing is how what you actually produce and how you produce it.
That view kind of assumes that it's a zero-sum game, that if there's a winner, there's a loser, when that's not necessarily the case. And my kind of intuitive assumption would be that poverty is the norm and wealth is the abnormal thing, just looking at it from a historic perspective, because poverty up until the past 200 years has been pretty widespread, and it's only a relatively recent thing. So to say that anything otherwise would, to me, seem a bit ridiculous, really.
And not just historically, you also, it's kind of the common sense position. Like, if you just lay down, like, you're not gonna have anything, because like you're not gonna produce anything for yourself, right? And so like that's, I don't know how to that's very that's a very weird thing to say, just because of how obvious it is, right? And so but if you actually take that position, that wealth is the norm and poverty is the exception, and poverty is something that you get from wealth if you do something actively wrong, then you tend to, as I said, overlook production, and you take things as given, and then you care more about distribution. And so you say, okay, we have all this wealth around us, and so if some people don't have it, that means that you just need to give a portion of your wealth to them, and it's going to be fine. But as I said before, that's not what the problem is, because if you just took the wealth that you have now and kind of carried on as normal with your consumption, well, in a couple of months, years, whatever, you're not going to have anything, because you need production, and production is the key, right? Production is what sustains you, not the wealth that you actually have now, right?
I very much agree.
And so then, if it's about production, you can't just redistribute what you already have. You have to provide for that production of those people that don't have those capacities, and how that production actually comes about. That's the question.
Wealth is generated by having the right infrastructure in the first place. Even if there was a really poor country and every country in the world donated them like 10% of their GDP, although they might be really well off in the short term, if they didn't have the infrastructure, in the long term, it might not actually make a difference, or it would make a very small difference. It's not fair to say it would make any difference.
And so it can obviously have loads of different impacts, and positive impacts and negative impacts. And what's key is where the money actually goes. If it goes for things that you consume, then that's going to have a very low impact. As you said, it might even have a negative impact. But if it can also be invested into something that kind of spurs on production, and then that can have snowballing effects into the future in terms of future prosperity, right? And so it depends on how you do it and what you do exactly. But that's a discussion for another time, I think, because that's really something very specific, and a lot of people have spent a lot of time on identifying where it is best to actually pour money in. So like in foreign aid, things like that, right?
Sure.
And so that's something that has been studied very, very closely, and but despite that, there hasn't been any clear answers, I feel, or at least satisfactory answers. But
Sure.
so let's get back to development theories. So you've got Acemoglu and Robinson. So what do they say about the area of development economics generally? Well, because they come up with their own theory, they need to take the previous theories and say why they don't work, right? And so they do that pretty well. What I have here, the positions I've taken either from the book, the Why Nations Fail, or from a couple of interviews and a couple of interviews and like talks that they've given, both of them. And so in somewhere in these resources they mention all of these things that I'm gonna just attribute to them now. And so they say that the other theories of development don't work, which are some of the popular ones are that national differences or differences in religious attitudes cause the differences in development, right? And so you have, for example, a very diligent work morale that's widespread among the population, or you have kind of the or some other nation might have this kind of custom of sleeping into the afternoon, and so these kind of differences, right? Or
Sure.
or religious attitudes as well. And so some economists, what they do is they explain wealth differences between different nations based on this. And so they like
It strikes me as quite a behavioural approach. I've seen lots of economic theories that purely focus on the kind of commerce and the industry side of it, and to me it's always struck me as very kind of mathematically centric, when a large portion of it might actually be, as you say, the work ethic that is a cultural aspect of an economy. Sorry.
No. So what they actually say is that this doesn't work. That's one of
Mm-hmm.
the theories that they say don't work, and they with all of them that they list, they say that you can show that it doesn't work because you have loads of counter examples where this doesn't play a role, or where the culture is broadly the same, or the religious attitudes are the same, and you have different outcomes. So there has to be
Okay.
something else, and so things like that, right? Excuse me. So something that you would pretty much expect.
Mm-hmm.
And then another explanation that they say is wrong is the geographic differences between different states. And so you have mountainous terrain, or you have very fertile land, or you're landlocked, or you're maritime, and so these things, or the prevalence of diseases among the population, or the effects of environment. And so this is another family of those kind of theories.
In saying that these theories don't work, are they saying that these alone don't work, or are they saying that they're not even worth considering? Because to me, kind of cultural work ethic, the geography of a country, whether they're plagued by disease, these are all important factors in my mind, because living in a place with fertile farmlands is very different than living in, I don't know, northern Norway, where it's icy all the time. Like there's going to be a natural difference there.
I think what they would say is that there is going to be a difference, and of course at the extremes you will have something that is unworkable. Right?
Sure.
But if you take out the extremes, then the differences that it actually produces are not that significant. And I don't know who is right. I don't know whether they are right, or whether the proponents of
Okay.
these theories are right. And but they would say that these are factors that can affect it, but these are not the key factors. These are far from the most important, and so they can't adequately explain wealth and poverty among different nations.
Yeah.
Because
I get you.
but they can be small influences here and there.
So they're not denying that they are influences, but they're just saying they're not perhaps as significant as people might think.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the third one that they say doesn't work in the development theory, that they say doesn't work, is leaders adopting right policies to enrich the place. And they say that this is probably the most popular thing among economists today, among political scientists, saying that it all depends on policies. It depends on those leaders instituting some policies that will lead to prosperity. And they say, okay, this might be something that is worth considering, but also that's not the key issue. And so I think what they're saying with all of these is that these can be some indicators, but this is not the ultimate cause, right? And so I actually think that their own theory is quite similar to the last one of the theory of leaders adopting right policies, but But we'll go over the differences and similarities a bit later.
Sure.
But I don't think when they say that this theory is wrong and they're positing their own theory against it, I don't really think that goes as much against it as they would have liked, maybe. And so, yeah, so as I said, Acemoglu and Robinson, they think that the other theories don't really work just because you have too many examples that disprove either of them, and that there's no clear correlation, and you have influences that are stronger. And so for example, for geographics and environment, you have the famous picture of Korea at night. The TV is off, but we'll show it later. So there is this famous picture of the Korean peninsula, and the north of the border between the Koreas is just dark, and the South Korea south of the border is just lit up with all kinds of things. And you can that's what Acemoglu and Robinson often show in their presentation about their theory, saying, okay, this is not a result of geography, because the geography is very, very similar. It's not the result of culture, broadly speaking, because this used to be one culture before it separated politically. And so this is one of those things that would be a counterexample to those theories, saying, yeah, look at how South Korea is developed. You can see the light emissions as a proxy of development, because it's quite a good proxy.
But to me, wouldn't that be public policy? Because I know that North Korea has lots of trade sanctions put on it because of its policies and its approach to politics and its outward relations. And how do they differentiate what they are saying is incorrect in the leaders play very little role when they're using this as evidence, which to me seems like evidence against their theory, if anything.
So their theory is the theory of institutions, which is something that kind of has in it the aspect of leaders choosing the right policies.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a bit different.
It's certainly broader by the sounds of it. If it means institutions, it doesn't necessarily mean that just single policies or specific leaders have an effect. It's the political system in its entirety.
Yes, exactly. And so they're saying that if you have good institutions, you will end up with broadly better leaders making better decisions, right? And so that it's going to produce that factor which leads to prosperity in some way. And so you can have another example other than the Koreas, saying that you have poor countries that might have a lot of natural resources that end up being wasted. So Venezuela famously has the world's largest oil reserves, but we know what Venezuela looks like now. The Congo DRC is quite famous for being very rich in natural minerals. It has, I think, it's diamonds.
There's also lots of rare earth minerals used in things like mobile phones, which can't be found in many other places. Yeah,
but Congo is an extraordinarily poor country, and
it's plagued by civil war, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not. I don't know if exactly civil war, but it's full of smaller conflicts everywhere, and there's no infrastructure. It's bad, right? And so the theory of institutions is something that is a way in which they say that poor and rich countries are organized in different ways. Right? And so Robinson says, quote, most poor countries are organized in ways which block people's incentives and block people's opportunities, and that creates poverty. And so that might be about policies, but it's about the institutional setup of the country, saying that some institutions, they produce these kinds of policies, and some institutions produce different kinds of policies, but that long-term setup, not necessarily the one policy that you institute, is going to determine the direction that the country is going to go. And so what they have is this typography of institutions. you've got economic institutions and you've got political institutions, and then you have extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. And so you've got this 2x2 matrix of extractive political institutions, extractive economic institutions, inclusive political institutions, and inclusive economic institutions. I'm going to go through all of these and say what these are according to them. And what they say is that if you have extractive institutions, well, those are the bad ones, and if you have inclusive institutions, well, those are the good ones, right?
Okay.
As you would expect, right? And so you can have inclusive economic institutions, and those. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Good. Let's start with extractive economic institutions. So they say that an institution is extractive if it is designed to enrich someone or some narrow group at the expense of everyone else, and if it's in some way kind of funnels money away from society to that kind of group.
So a good example would be somewhere like Ukraine pre-revolution, where they had the people in government siphoning off billions of I don't know what the currency is, but lots of money into their own accounts and enrich themselves at the expense of the country, which seemed to suffer for it.
Yep, and that could be one example, and another example could be simply monopolies. So monopolies are typically state sanctioned, state established, and so then you have one entity, whether it's a person, a group, or a firm, or whatever, that has that right, that exclusive right to that resources, selling that resource, or producing that good, and everyone else does it illegally.
Sure.
And so if you have that, you will have that doesn't necessarily produce like economic degradation, but it concentrates all the advantages of that area, of that economic sphere, to that group, right? Because they have no competition. So it still provides some kind of service, but the service is very bad and very expensive.
I think the kind of go-to example for that is the De Beers diamond company, who I think control something like 90% of all diamond mining, and therefore they're able to extract a great degree of wealth out of countries that otherwise might seek to benefit far more from their natural resources.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish natural monopolies from legal monopolies, because you can have natural monopolies that aren't really monopolies but are called that because it resembles that somewhat, and those don't have to be extractive in this way at all. So if you have something that's monopolized by fiat, then that's a very different situation. So I don't know about that diamond
Sure.
example that you, maybe it is a real legal monopoly. So I don't know, but if it is, then that would be an example of an extractive economic institution.
So it's got to be supported by legal institutions. It can't just be a company that has a large share of the worldwide economy.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
And so then you have what they use, what Acemoglu and Robinson use, is the example of Bill Gates versus Carlos Slim, and saying, okay, look at Bill Gates. He's created something which is very valuable for a lot of people, and he's made himself rich in the process, and that's good because everyone benefits from it, including him. And then look at Carlos Slim, and he's what he's produced is economic degradation. There's some studies that actually saying that he actually cost Mexico a lot of like a couple of percentage points of growth. Right?
What is it that he's actually done? Because I've not heard of him before.
I don't know the details of how he actually managed to have that large of an impact on the economy, but this is what he's what they use as an example of a person to contrast with Bill Gates, because of those extractive institutions that are in place that allow him to kind of siphon off wealth from society to him, and do that while not creating anything for, or not much for the society, right?
While on the topic of Mexico, a good example might be the cartels, because they're certainly extracting a lot of wealth from Mexico through corruption, and that
Yep.
they almost act as an institution because in many ways they are worth trillions of dollars at this point.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of examples, and but it's the thing is, we'll talk about some of the
Sure.
criticisms later as well. But the thing is that you often these definitions are quite vague, so you run a risk of saying that anything that looks bad falls under this definition, anything that
Okay.
looks good, but that's not your fault, or that's the fault of this theory of saying, okay, good things are good and bad things are bad, fine, you know. But but let's go on. With extractive economic institutions, you also have extractive political institutions that often complement it. So what Acemoglu says is, quote, institutions that concentrate political power in the hands of the few without any sort of checks and allow them to use repression to get their way. And that's what he says are extractive political institutions. And so this is not necessarily about economic resources, but it's about the decision-making power in society and about distribution of political power, and that can be sometimes a bit confusing as well, because that runs into the problem of distinguishing between political power and economic power, which is sometimes not so clear, and so that might be more difficult in some ways. But the way that he kind of brings it closer to you is saying, quote, what use are economic institutions that tell you to work for low wages if I can't force you to work for low wages? That's how he distinguishes between the two. So like economic institutions that tell you that you need to work for low wages, for example, I don't know, if you got those monopolies on something, that if you want to work in an industry, you need to work for that specific company because that has the legal monopoly. Well, that company will then be able to pay you very, very, very low wages just because it has no competition to bid up the price of your labor. And so that would be an extractive political institution, extractive economic institution, sorry. But then you can have you will have to have extractive political institutions as well, because if you didn't, enough people would get angry with that state of being, with that situation, that they would try to overturn it politically in some way. So
Sure.
if you had a lot of people being actually involved in the political decision making, then you would not have that situation last very long, because they would try to change it. So that's the kind of idea. And of course we can ask how well that actually works in practice, or whether that would happen, or whether there would be other pressures that would change the direction in which this is going. But this is the idea that they have.
Okay.
Right, and so then you have inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. And so inclusive economic institutions, those would be things like secure property rights, the trade between people and companies being allowed, and the courts enforcing contracts, things like that. So these kind of common sense institutions that you would want, because they're good, they sound nice, it's fine. And then you have inclusive political institutions that would be, Robinson says that's basically distribution of political power in society. And so that's what he says, that political power is not just focused in the hands of one person or one group, but it's kind of broadly spread around, and everyone has, or not everyone, but at least a lot of people have access to political venues and means to change something through politics. So that's what they mean by inclusive political institutions. Well, Robinson actually says that he doesn't say it, but he implies it, that he means democracy. That this is what he means when he says inclusive political institutions. But we'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow whether that's something that would be best, or that is best for development. But you could even though he implies that he means democracy, you can imagine other ways in which you have power distributed throughout society other than democracy. And so then, and Acemoglu says of inclusive political institutions that they quote, create a more equal distribution of power, sometimes refers to as pluralism, and they don't let anyone have absolute control over the power of the state. So that's a rehash of what I already said.
At least that's true in theory. I mean, of course, you've got the case in the UK where we definitely have a democracy, but it has been referred to many times as an elective dictatorship where, although it is a democracy, the executive branch of government has the power to do more or less what it wants to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think that would be kind of an interesting example of any inclusive political institutions producing extractive economic institutions, which is something that they say would tend to not happen. But it's something that I think you can see in a lot of different countries in the West, not just the UK. Right, and so then what is according to them the key to creating inclusive economic institutions, right? Robinson says that the power of the state is key in that enforcing the law is the precondition of actually being able to do anything like that. And then you have this kind of matrix, which is what I was describing before. You have those four types of institutions and the combinations between them. So the idea of development theories is that you move from the bottom right to the top left, and just because we have this 2x2 matrix, you can move them in two ways, like to the left first and then up, or up first and then left. And there has been some discussion around which is better, which is more effective in actually making you being developed, because obviously what you want, or what is best, is inclusive political institutions, inclusive economic institutions, because that's what you defined as good, but how to get there is a central question.
Surely you could move between both extractive economic institutions to the inclusive kind and the extractive political institutions to the inclusive kind at the same time. You don't have to just go down one route or the other. It seems like a very unusually separated theory.
Yeah. Well, you're right. And what they say is that you have natural synergies between political institutions and economic institutions. So if you have one type of political institution, is gonna attract the economic institution that corresponds with it, right? And so and that's kind of the discussion around it. So what is the first, and what comes after, right? Is it that you can have inclusive economic institutions and that's going to draw in the political institutions, or is it the other way around? Or is it that if you have extractive political institutions, it's going to draw into to the extractive side the economic institutions as well? And they say some things about it, but that's what hasn't been really clear, right?
Okay.
But they say there are natural synergies. So if you have both extractive institutions, they tend to kind of reinforce each other, and it tends to not move in any direction. And at the same time, if you have both types of institutions being inclusive, then that's gonna be an equilibrium where it's gonna stay, and it's not gonna be like one of those two just suddenly becoming something else.
So it's kind of suggesting that there are 2 points of equilibrium where a country will trend towards.
Yeah, exactly. And so then the example that they give of no inclusive political institutions and no inclusive economic institutions, or the reverse, is Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm quoting again: there are few places in Sub-Saharan Africa today where property rights are secure, the elites allow a level playing field, the courts work in an unbiased fashion, and it's no surprise that productivity is low and people are discouraged from investing. And so that's kind of the overview example that they give, saying, okay, this is what it looks like in the bottom right corner. Well, and so on the topic of how these institutions come about, which is the most important question if you develop this framework, is it's actually divided into two questions. One is how to create those inclusive institutions if you don't have them, and the other one is how have they developed in the past if at some point there were none before, right? So there needs to be some way. If there's some inclusive institutions now, there needs to be some way in which they developed on their own in the past, and there also needs to be some way in which you can develop them actively.
So they're suggesting that it's something that can develop internally within a country. You don't need outside intervention to help out, and that's kind of counter to the view that might be kind of circulating in Europe about intervening in African countries to ensure that they're stable politically and therefore can develop economically.
Well, that's what they're trying to answer, like these type of questions, and saying, okay, they have a way of developing on their own, but you can also develop them actively and like not just rely on that happening on its own somewhere. And what they say is that there is this thing called institutional drift, which is just a concept that describes that institutions change over time slowly in kind of some basically random fashion, and that happens in a different way in each country. That is kind of a slow movement of politics, of political institutions. And then you have critical junctures, which are major events that disrupt the balance of society. And that can be kind of political, demographic, war. That can be, and those could be new political or social opportunities. And at those events that they call critical junctures, they're going to intersect with that institutional drift, and that amplifies that direction in which the country has been going. And
seems relatively intuitive to me.
Yeah. I mean, again, the problem with this is that it says something that is kind of obvious, and you can't really argue against it, but it's not really clear what it actually says, right?
Yeah, I get what you mean there.
Because they say that things happen slowly over time, yes, and then when things happen fast, then the direction in which they go, that gets accelerated.
It's so superficial that it's almost meaningless, isn't it? Because things can only go slowly or quickly, and they've kind of got both bases covered. And
yep.
Although, what's the utility in having a theory that explains something that's so obvious?
and so they say that the way that inclusive institutions developed in the past was that you had a lot of states that were going like slowly as institutional drift in different directions, and then you had some revolutions or wars or things like that, which then spurred these states to, which caused this dramatic institutional change. And in some states, it went in the direction of extractive institutions or more or different extractive institutions, and in some states, it went into inclusive institutions. Fine, why not? And so, when they say this, well, they also say that you can also cause these changes now actively, and so that's the flip side, right? And so this kind of intervention in the present, that's often framed in the language that is a bit colonial, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or wrong. But that it's more about building something somewhere else than just something happening on your own.
Sure.
Turf, right. And so that has this kind of a bad connotation historically, and so that like the fact that it sounds a bit colonial doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. If there's something that's going really wrong and really tragic, like in some place, you might want to intervene in that to prevent atrocities from happening.
I don't necessarily think it's like an insidious thing, because I imagine this was a theory developed in the West, and the West we're not starving.
Yep.
We're relatively okay, the average person. And it makes sense that something that's focused upon improving the lives of people who are still kind of stuck in subsistence living, that it's speaking in language which is separate from themselves.
Yeah, I mean, when your theory says, as it does in the Matrix, that well, in this Matrix, it sounded ominous, but if your theory says that there's natural synergies and there's 2 points of equilibrium, either that where all the institutions are extractive or where all the institutions are inclusive, then if you have countries in the world where you're in the bottom right, you're somewhere where all the institutions are extractive, you won't have that natural change, or you probably won't have that natural change into something else just because they all support each other. They have these natural synergies. And so you would want to do is to disturb that equilibrium to jumpstart the move into the inclusive institutions in any of those directions, right? And so that's the view within that theory.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily saying I support that view, but that's what makes sense within that framework that they've created, right? And so if you have those two directions in which you can go, first left and then up, or first up and then left, then you Robinson actually says what he thinks is better, because he says that if you say, okay, we'll create inclusive economic institutions first, we'll go up, and then we'll go left, we'll create inclusive political institutions as well. Well, he says that's basically modernization theory, and that doesn't work, he says. So what's modernization theory? We're going to talk about it in more detail tomorrow, but it's just saying that you can liberalize an economy without creating a wider political participation in that country, in that system, and that economic growth, that economic success is going to translate into more people being politically involved and into those inclusive political institutions being actually created. And so Robinson says that probably doesn't work, that there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't, and might be, probably is. So he says that it's probably better to go the blue way on the screen. So first left and then up, and so in his words, first you create a democracy, and then within that democracy, then you will get more inclusive economic institutions, just because I'm in the theory, like that's not what I necessarily think, but that he says if you have a democracy, then the extractive economic institutions are unsustainable, just because only a small part of the population benefits from it, and so if everyone wants to benefit from it, then they'll change that. So those economic institutions will be changed into inclusive ones if you have the inclusive political institutions. But so that they're saying that this is how it works, and that there's a couple of exceptions. He says that China is an exception of a country that moved from the bottom right upwards and then kind of stayed there, and that generally doesn't happen according to that theory, because that's not the equilibrium. But he says that's an exception, and he explains it in some ways, and he also says that that's long-term unsustainable, so that China is going to move either there or there.
Hopefully to more inclusive for the sake of the Western world.
Yeah, so according to Robinson, it can either move into inclusive political institutions, or it can move back into extractive economic institutions, but it can't just stay where it is long term. Okay, so we will go over some of the criticisms now, because like this is something that they kind of lay out, and we've touched upon a couple of those, but it's important to bring them together. So, as you said before, the theory is very broad. You can define any type of things as inclusive or exclusive as you see fit, and so since you don't really talk about specifics, what you end up with is just saying, okay, I like good things and I dislike bad things. Sure.
It seems like
what a coincidence.
It seems like one of those theories where it's almost unfalsifiable, because there's such a great degree of subjectivity to it that it can suit anyone's interpretation of what is inclusive and exclusive.
Yeah.
And therefore people can interpret it however they wish.
Yeah, exactly. So since they outline a little bit of what inclusive economic institutions, for example, might be, right? So they list a couple of things. Okay, so this might be it, this might be it as well, but they're not exhaustive in those lists. They don't say, well, if it has a characteristic X, it's not inclusive anymore, except for those basic ones that I mentioned, kind of the fact that it's designed to work for only a small part of the population and not for most or everyone. So like those types of things they have delineated, but that's not enough. That still produces this kind of confusion of what those institutions or what types of institutions actually are, right? And so that's one type of criticism. Well, then another one is that that this is not original in any meaningful way. This is basically a rehash of the argument that economic freedom and individual freedom are basically the same thing, right? And so if you imagine in this theory, if you kind of relabel the things and you imagine inclusive economic rights as economic freedom and inclusive political rights as personal freedom, then you have a theory that has been around for a long time and that says, okay, if you have only one of those things, that's not sustainable because those things are kind of interconnected, and so you can have either none or both.
Yeah, that seems perfectly reasonable to me, because part of individual freedoms is economic freedom, I think. It seems an integral part of that, and to separate it and say it's a different thing, although it may happen in some niche cases, normally they come as a bundle.
And then so if you relabel it like that, and you look at those two types of movements again, then you can see why I was a bit skeptical of his conclusion of that green path being not possible or bad or worse, and the blue path being better, because you could say, okay, well, to get both economic freedom and personal freedom, well, you need to first get personal freedom, and then if you have personal freedom, you'll get economic freedom. Well, why? How? Like, that's not necessarily the case. I don't see why that would have to happen, and why that would be more likely than the other way around. If saying, okay, if you don't have either, you need to first get economic freedom, and if you get enough economic freedom, then you will get individual freedom as well, or personal freedom. Well, I don't know, that those, both of those sound like something that could be the case, or could, or maybe not, but it doesn't sound any more like something that you could say one of those would be completely wrong and one of those completely
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
It seems to me that it could just as easily be, you could go the route of reforming your political institutions and then that will change your economy, or vice versa. To suggest that one is far more likely than the other, it to me seems a little bit narrow-minded.
Well, and so then yeah, as we said, you can rephrase a lot of those things as economic rights and civil rights, and but then if you do that, you have the problem of saying, okay, economic rights are part of individual personal rights that are natural rights, that kind of sphere, but civil rights are political rights. That's something that is not part of natural rights, that is distinct from it. And so then you have you might run into the problem of your natural personal individual rights clashing with those political rights, and so this theory doesn't know how to deal with that at all. And so if you say, okay, this theory is just a rehash of those older theories, well, then those older theories were trying to solve some kind of a clash between those two types, which this doesn't do at all, right?
I suppose it's looking at things at a national level, and to look at the kind of civil rights and economic rights, you need to look at an individual level. So the level of analysis kind of shapes how they're looking at it,
Yeah,
even though they're describing the same sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so another point of criticism is that they take democracy as an inclusive political institutions, when in fact it could be the opposite as well. It could produce institutions that could be actually exclusive or extractive or not so inclusive as they might think. And that's what we will talk about more tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to be talking about whether democracy is actually important for development or not. And so the last thing I want to say is that, as I said in the beginning, you have Acemoglu and Robinson creating this theory, and then their book becoming very famous, and they becoming celebrities because of it. And this is only possible because they advocate for something that is really likable and really mainstream, right? And okay. I'm quite blunt about it, but it's actually true, right? What they say is, I like good things and I dislike bad things, and they say it in a very persuasive way. And so they have this theory of explaining why democracy is good and why economic growth is good. Well, yes, everyone agrees. Sure. And so because they get to take a lot of historical examples and put them in the book. I'm not saying is well done. It's really well done. The book is a accumulation of like 15 years of their research into different states and different developments in those states. And so they put it all together, create nice stories out of it, and then tell this kind of overarching story of these institutions. But so it's very well done, but it's something that is very likable. It's very non-controversial, right? Because it's saying, okay, some places have good things and some places have bad things. Good.
That's a very controversial position. Wow.
Yeah, and so I'm a bit skeptical towards not exactly the theory as a whole, because it might be more or less right. It might be that a particular application of it is actually correct or more correct than the others, but it's just that as they present it, it's not necessarily as valuable as if it would be if they came forward with something that would be controversial, or they would have to fight for, right?
Sure. It seems to me, just from what you've briefly described, that they seem to be good at identifying factors which contribute to an economy's success, but in theorizing an overarching theory, I don't think it necessarily seems to translate quite as well to what they're trying to describe as they are attempting to.
Yeah, and it's drawn the book has drawn this type of criticisms from all around. Like some people are saying about the book that it's been a disappointment because it shows some things, but it's not necessarily as rigorous as it could be. Of course, as I said, it's written in a popular way. It's not meant to be a scientific piece of work. And so that's a limitation that it's necessarily going to have. But yeah, so it's something that's been really influential, and it's something that made them very famous, and that they might be right about in some ways, but maybe not to an extent that they would have liked.
Sure. Thank you very much for watching, and make sure to tune in tomorrow, and we'll be talking about whether democracy is important for development.